I would say to anybody that's interested in this subject that instead of disbelieving that there are flying saucers, an adult, educated approach is know that there are now and have been flying saucers, because as we see now on the History Channel and of course in lots of literature, something's been moving those boulders. I've been to Baalbek. I've been in the Bekaa Valley, and with a camera and a small gun, and whatever was there before the Romans came and built that temple up there at Baalbek out there. Those stones are the size of this house, bigger. Those are huge stones, and they've got them in South America that are as big again. So something had to be able to move those. Something had to be able some master builders were here a long time ago, and if you look at their art, you will see things with wings all over it. And wings is the depiction that the primitive people would give to something that could fly. And this is all quite logical. Jayan believed it. Bert England believed it. Jayan Taz believed it. They believed that craft had been here. Electrogravity was not something new. It was something that we're going to rediscover, and they felt that they had rediscovered it. They were sure. They had the motor was working. There was no doubt about it. It didn't go on or off. It was turned on, and there was available. And another thing, the more things they plugged into it, the better the machine liked it. They never found a limit to how there was no electrical limit. If you put something big enough behind a car, for instance, with a chain and a flatbed behind it, a big enough rock, the car won't be able to pull it eventually.
Yeah, the Cromrie converter, when you short it out, it runs faster.
Well, I've never seen a Cromrie converter, but the cold heat engine, they loaded that up with all kinds of power demands. And it provided the power that was demanded like that, right away. Now, the question often arose, how did they open the valve inside the magnet where the energy's coming through? That was never sufficiently answered to anybody's satisfaction. I know it was something that Bert England wasn't sure about either, but he was looking, and Ian Taz too.
What do you mean he was looking? Because who designed it? I mean, the person that designed it would know.
No, they designed it. They took, as I say, they examined the magnets inside the repulsine motor. They looked at how the S-shaped, which are a truncated version of what is full blown in the cold heat engine, where they've turned them into sort of like a corkscrew, but bigger at one end and smaller at the other, so that the intake part is big because the gas is being exploded into there, and it's being compressed all the way down. So when it collapses at the small back end, it collapses to a very cold temperature. That's how gases behave. And
if you read Walter Russell's works,
I've heard about it, but I haven't ever read it.
It's all explained in there with the 40 Cs.
Ah, okay. Well, I didn't know that. I've never read Walter Russell. They, I'm sure, had, because they had encyclopedic knowledge. Anything that you would mention to Bert England, if I could put him here instead of me, I would gladly. He would be able to give you encyclopedic answers on all of these subjects. Unfortunately, time is the great enemy of human people, and the biological solution is we all end up dead. And they are dead now. And one of the things that really burned me was that they had broken through the fuels requirement. They had definitely, 100% definitely obsoleted all the fossil fuels. That's oil, coal, natural gas, all of it, and nuclear. Totally unnecessary. And because of the hegemony between the United States and the Soviet Union, they took the financial decision, the political decision, that they were going to lead the Russians by the nose through industrialization, so that get rid of the Communist Party. And the architect of these ideas, I don't know who the original one was, but my father and the others laid this at the feet of young Henry Kissinger, who had a powerful influence over Nelson Rockefeller, a powerful influence. Rockefeller liked men that could get things done. He found Kissinger in Germany as a young man, after the war. And Kissinger's star rose like very few others have ever risen. So one day he was a German-speaking German working in a prison camp run by Americans for Germans. And in not too long, he was headed for big-time greatness in the United States and was the right-hand man to Nelson Rockefeller. And people think, well, Rockefeller wasn't in office then. That was Richard Nixon. Well, Rockefeller didn't have to be in office. Rockefeller was the king of America. And a lot of people just don't seem to understand how America really works. Nelson Rockefeller was the boss. And he basically was the man responsible for charting the rise and success of the middle-class educational values. I love him for that. That was an America that I grew up with. That's the America I love. That's the America I want back now. The British guys overtook the Germans. The British guys' science was better than the German science. The Germans didn't have superior science. The Germans had superior researchers. It turned out the science was all coming back from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago out of these books. The Vedas, outside of India, you're not going to find anybody that can read this. Sanskrit is a real old language, and this is the language before Sanskrit. So it's old. It's old.
So back on the project, as it developed, you had T. Townsend Brown from the United States and probably a few others, but there was some magnetics experts that came up.
There were, but the biggest magnetic expert that they had was Bert England.
Yeah.
That was one of his areas, and Burton and Ian Tawes would talk, and the man that conditioned the magnets, and the man that cut the magnets, and the man that was putting diamond dust on wires to cut magnets so that they wouldn't break, and heating magnets, and refrigerating magnets, and giving oil treatments to magnets, and doing about 50 other things that I don't want to get into today on tape here, because, as you know, I have a treasure trove of all the Designex, energetics, Entrain systems, all of it, years and years of research, logs, the several working machines, parts, magnets, all of it is all in one big treasure trove of, as I've said, would fill 2/3 of an 18-wheeler truck from the floor to the roof. And that has all been waiting.
But who is this guy that was doing all this cutting? And
that was Ian Tawes. That was he was the right-hand man with Dr. Bert England. Everybody deferred to Bert England, not because they were told to.
They had successfully developed a, for the want of a better term, a free energy device that would power not only the world, but would power these anti-gravity craft.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, why in the world would the Canadian Premier want to give this up?
He didn't. Well, first of all, thank you for asking me this. There are a whole gang of answers to the questions, and they're all sort of interlocking. I'd like to begin with the first and obvious one. The British royal classes, the upper classes in England, who I've had the privilege of meeting, several of them was when I lived in England. The notion that Canada is an independent and free place is for the Canadian voter. You get to a point with power and money up the social scale, as they say, the Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, where you find that things aren't exactly what they appear to be. Canada didn't have any robust science other than the science that was going on at Avro at that time. As I say, we knew from Lloyd Pinckney that Lloyd Pinckney knew all about Nikola Tesla. All the other scientists knew about Tesla. They all knew that he electrified America, and they all loved him. They all knew everybody knew Tom Edison, what he was and where he came from. He sold sandwiches and hookers on a train. That's how he met J.P. Morgan, on a train. It's a true story, God. Anyway, this business about English technology, German technology, American technology, what happened was they were feeding off each other. They had subsets of specialties which were being integrated. And the great integrator of all of this was Bert England and Tawes, and the two of them. And they integrated things, and they commingled designs, and they like shuffling a deck of cards. They were amazing. They took first principles and abstracted from first principles how it should work, and pretty near, usually they were able to jerry-rig it to work. There were some problems with the Townsend craft. The Townsend craft, they were testing its lift. As Tom Bearden has often noted, the first 80% of the weight that you make disappear off any object by lifter technology is a lot easier than the final 20%. And it's that final 3% that where the energy, where it all has to be balanced just right to get off the ground, so that it's hovering. Well, Bert England was definitely the inventor of magnetic boots, and they had tested because they had to set this thing down. So the first thing they wanted to do was be able to lift something to have it up off the floors. They laid a coil. There was various sizes. This first one was about 2.5, 3 inches in diameter, and the final one was smaller in diameter. And it was metals that were wire, and they had done something to this wire so that it was rotated around in a certain way, and they had an outer casing that Taz fitted it all into, so that it looked like a garden hose, but it was solid. It wasn't a garden hose at all. This was an electrical conductor. And they wound it all into a circle on the floor. Just the circles got bigger and bigger. And they took the electricity that was coming out of the industrial electricity that was coming from hydro to that hangar at Avro. And they ran electric charges through it. They put a plate down. They put this it's like a big coil of wire, but there wasn't. It was pretty tightly wound. And they ran charges through it, and they pulsed the charges into the plate. And what they got was they did the same thing on the bottom of what was going to be the base of the craft. And lo and behold, the top one came up and hovered in place above the bottom structures. And they spent months changing and doing different things with the electrical inputs. And they got it to a place where they had something hovering above something else. And if you got down there, and they did, and put cameras through to be able to prove that nothing was touching, and it felt solid, and they called it magnetic bearings. And that's where that was invented. It wasn't invented at Honeywell. The hovercraft wasn't invented at Honeywell. The steering the jet down technology, I mean, I could go on. There was a lot of technologies that were absolutely invented there, and they didn't file a patent on. They weren't interested in any of that stuff. They weren't interested in hovercrafts, or what they wanted was they were on a race, a beeline race for a finished product. About that time, especially when you look at the pictures of the Russian copy of Silverbug, which is the Saratov 12-ton, same weight, same everything, it's just identical. They stole it. They built that. They duplicated the T. Townsend's Silverbug was duplicated in Russia, halfway around the world in the Urals, in Area 51 in Russia. The two of them, there were slight variances because, as I've so often said, they got the craft, but they did not get the engine because the engine was not built at Avro. The engine, they outsourced that to Designex. And I know where that engine is, by the way, and it's a real live, a wonderful opportunity, a treasure that's awaiting somebody who's going to end up wanting to buy that. And it's for sale. But the more important thing is, for this purpose, I believe here, this discovery of the truth of what happened from an eyewitness and a close participant, as close as the son of the people can be, because I did not have a triangular badge, and I was only allowed into Avro a couple of times on Visitors' Day and never into any of these special places. I had the run of the place at Designex, and when they came over, I got to meet people who came from Avro to Designex to see things. But I was never, of course, at that age. I mean, you can't take a kid into this kind of thing, and I was never in there. But I heard about it from my father, and I heard about it from Yayan Thomas. Yayan got my dad permission to be taken in because of the amount of money my dad hid in the thing, and because you've seen my father's discharge certificates. There's a lot of people in Canada right now that say, oh, Bill Doyle was never in the RCMP. That's a lot of hooey. That kid just makes up stories. You can't believe it. He's still doing it. Look at Doyle. He's 70 years old, and he's still talking about this. Everybody knows there's no such a thing as a fuelless electricity generator. Who would say a thing like that? You know, without batteries, it won't turn on. This is what you're up against when you have this perspective. However, the magnetic boots, if you look at the photograph of Silverbug, you'll notice there's no gantry around it. And that's because when that door opens, even though you can't see it, they created magnetic bearing technology, and you could walk out and walk down like a flight of stairs or a ramp and walk right down with these boots on, which were boots like rubber boots, excepting a little more. Around the foot and all down the bottom, there were magnets and coils built to parallel the magnets and coils that they put on the floor. And you could adjust it, these fields, and they did adjust these fields so that you could open a door and seem to be walking on air, but you weren't walking on air. These are magnetic bearing surfaces. It's as solid engineering principles as this watch I'm wearing here from Switzerland. You know, it's the kind of thing that once you've got it, it's a commodity. You can just build them and sell them, and you put them anywhere you want. On the ground, they were able to build magnetic bearing surfaces between, in the way I described earlier, with a round plate and a coil, a round plate and a coil on top. When they tried to duplicate that into steps, they were having problems because they needed all kinds of different vectors and angles, and they found that they couldn't sustain those. So what they did was, if you look at the photograph of the Saratov copy of Silverbug, you will see that when the doors open to the fuselage, which is an oval-shaped door that opens out, that actually opens in, because you can just, when you're looking from the outside, you just see the door. And what was happening was, in the original Silverbug craft, at the T. Townsend Brown one, at the big hangar at Avro, when they walked out the door, according to Yayan and Bert, who basically invented, for lack of a better word, this system, they walked out the door for a little bit, and there was a ramp that walked down to the ground. And what they were wearing were these magnetic boots. And you could see the boots on the people that wore them, but you couldn't see the magnetic structure because it was built into the bottom and from the ankle down. There were things on the side, things around the toes, and things on the bottom. And what this was about was creating, by having large magnets that were treated and then conditioned, which apparently is two separate subjects, if I'm remembering what Dr. England used to say to me. And this allowed man to actually open the door to this craft and walk out onto something that you could not see and stand just as like it was terra firma and walk right down onto the ground that you could see. And how they were doing this was by a technology they called magnetic bearing technology. Only this was not the usual magnetic bearing technology as Honeywell has it, with the little globules up to the four little points, which are housing magnets that are themselves having a current that you can't see go around between the magnets that are inside the housing where the magnetic bearing is to take place. This was not inside a housing per se, but inside a room. But they had this going. They had people wearing boots that I've described, walking out of that door and walking out just a little bit and then walking down a ramp and walking down to the ground. And why I'm talking about this is in the photographs, where in any of the Russian photographs, there's no gantry. They never push a thing up to the side of the plane like they would if it was in any other type of craft. There was no dollies. There was none of that there. It was not there because they didn't use it.
I have a question with regard to the Saratov photograph.
Yep.
How do you know the photograph that's on the Saratov website is the migrated silverbug.
Well, it's identical. That's what the...
Externally, it's identical. But the information that Saratov, that Ekip put out, is that it's still under development.
That's the new information. I have the original information that I saw that so enraged me that was when I saw that picture. I fumed for about an hour, and I jumped right on my computer and wrote a letter to the late senator, who was the Senate leader at that time, Ted Stevens. And then I got on to information by telephone to Washington, and I got his Senate phone number, and I got his area code, and so on, and I called the office. And I told them who it was, and that I had something of strategic, of national importance that most Americans wouldn't know about. And I was calling from Canada, and my name was William Doyle, and left my name and number. I didn't get a call back. And I just kept following up with emails and letters and phone calls, and then I left a letter that I left a message that I knew somebody that was a name that I was to give him, and that would lend a lot of credibility to anything I had to say. And that name was Boyja Angel, who was the first marshal for the territory of Alaska, and was there when Senator Ted Stevens of Alaska got them to make Alaska a state. And I told him that this craft that the Russians were trying to sell was an exact copy, and they've written about this in the Mitrokin archive, about the Russians, the different kinds of Russian spies that were present at Avra. And I also told him, I said, it sounds incredulous at this time, but my father's connections in the intelligence community in Canada told him that the Americans had deliberately leaked this to the Russians. And I can promise you, Ted Stevens was almost speechless, and he was enraged at the same time on the other end. And I talked to him about Kurt Weldon. I talked to him about... So
you did eventually talk to Stevens directly?
I talked to Stevens briefly on the telephone. I talked to RJ or HJ, who was, I believe, his son-in-law. And they gave me a bypass to get away. The name was McPherson and Associates. They gave me another office and said, when you want to write to me to get it through, Mr. Doyle, he said, you just write it to McPherson and Associates. And I had the proper Washington address, which was not the same address as his office. And I sent things there, and a guy got mailed back from him, as you saw. So I knew he knew about it. And then, of course, there was a huge investigation in Washington. It was a scandal on the Hill.
A senior federal law enforcement official confirms the FBI conducted 6 searches Monday of businesses and residences relating to the Weldon probe, including the Philadelphia home of Karen Weldon, the congressman's daughter. Neither Karen Weldon nor her attorney returned CNN's calls for comment. Congressman Weldon told reporters in Pennsylvania, quote, "I've not done anything wrong. I've never helped my daughter get anything. My kids are qualified on their own." The investigation appears to be focused on whether the congressman helped 2 Russian companies and 2 Serbian brothers become clients of his daughter's lobbying firm.
Whatever hit the fan behind closed doors, but immediately Weldon resigned his seat, and they were about to indict VP Cheney, who was Kurt Weldon's sponsor in Washington, until all of that was taken away. And there was billions and billions and billions of dollars had been given to the Russians so the Russian scientists wouldn't sell nuclear devices. And more millions have been given to the Russians for various technologies. But what nobody seemed to be aware of was that there was this hegemony going on between the United States and the Russians, and these things had, in the main, already been paid for. And this was like a second or a third time payment. We just assumed that the money was going to highly placed party members who were in favor with Putin or the people before Putin. I can't be accurate as to the date, but I remember how I felt when I saw that, because I knew for a fact that to be picture postcard copy from one to the other, the only thing that I could see that looked a little different was that the 2 appendages that come out for the ventilated supercavitation devices, the precursor out, they squirted out liquefied atmosphere. about 40 to 50 meters ahead of the craft to collapse the atmosphere so that the whole craft would be pulled in, so to speak, and it was an assist way to cloak it so it couldn't be seen by the naked eye, because nobody could take pictures of it landing and taking off, which is what they wanted. I was under the impression that Silverbug craft was put on onto a truck and towed us away from the region of the airport, because there were satellites from many countries, including the United States, of course, but other countries that were looking at all the big airports in North America, and Toronto was certainly one of them. And because, of course, Toronto got extra attention because they knew that Avro was there, and they knew they built military planes there. The Russians did, the Chinese did, and anybody else that was interested did. But the possibility of having a craft in Russia appear spontaneously as if this could have been invented at two places by synchronistic parallel development, no. That we know for a fact, because of the defecting spies that came out and gave British intelligence everything, that this was a 100% definite link between the project at Avro, that information, as that information was developed and as they made progress and more progress and progress upon progress with the different elements coming together of the Silverbug, that all of that in real time as it was happening was being sent to Russia. So we know pretty well that regardless of what EKIP was about, which is not about, there was nothing EKIP about Silverbug. Silverbug was not a particularly green craft per se, excepting it didn't have the Designex impact on the T. Townsend Brown work. Was the only major impact was the coming up with a zero fuel engine, a cold heat engine system.
We did secure some footage of the flying disc in the hangar. The code name for the project is EKIP, and it has been designed for humans to fly. We asked the scientist in charge of the project what propulsion system the craft uses, but he would not divulge what he called classified information.
The development of the anti-gravity craft you've described, you've given us a nice overview of that, but these are all military projects, both in Avro Canada and also in Russia. They're all buried and in the States. Now the question is, being military projects, there has to be a weapons system on board. Otherwise, I mean, none of the military are interested in things just randomly flying around sightseeing. I mean, other than reconnaissance, but the goal is always to put weapons on something. So
nobody ever mentioned. It's a point well taken, and I concede the point before I answer. However, and you're right, and that is logical, and there must have been. However, the original saucer that T.T. Brown was working on had a chemical engine to it that they had migrated to get that kind of high voltage, high power, big diameter electric flows. They were using the German fuels. But the fuels only gave the craft the capability of rising up off the ground and traveling a very short distance before it had to come back for refueling. It was not efficient as a form of a conveyor of people and munitions and a weapon or whatever they had there. And besides, at just about that time, another of the special projects, that private venture projects that they were working on, it wasn't exactly a commission. If you can design it, and build it and get a working copy going and be able to explain it to us, they said to Yayan, we will buy it from you like the solid fuels. And after the solid fuel project, and after the zero fuel engine project, which had its name changed in 1961 to cold heat engine, because they didn't want to upset anybody anymore. With zero fuel really was a poorly chosen name if they didn't want to bug. But they were in your face, and they were letting the Exxon know that they had something really super. They were expecting to be cheered. They got booed. And now to the weapon. the fourth project was called the cold beam weapon, and the name, the official name at Designex for this was called the PETITION project. And Betatron is not something I made up or invented. Betatron was the actual term that Ian Thomas put on this and Bert England put on this at the beginning before I ever came on the scene. I do know because I asked them, where do you test this? How does the American government know about this? I mean, can I see this, please? Well, no, you have to be, one day I'm sure you will, but you're just going to have to be patient because we're having a little problem with them, except they love the weapon. I said, well, please, just tell me, where did they see it? And Ian Thomas looked at me one day in the office, and my father was right there, and he said at China Lake, where we test everything for them. They want to see something where it goes bang or goes off. They wanted to see the fuels, China Lake. Now, China Lake is a big area that the United States Air Force uses in California, and it's had many interesting things let go there, but on 2 occasions, they were out there with a Betatron weapon that was that long and one handheld. And effectively, it made things disappear. The very, very cold beam out of it. And it has a peculiar architecture inside. A geometry, if you will. Negative radiant electricities. Spark goes up between 2 small carbon things. We all know about a carbon arc. But what's maybe not known about is the mirror technology that Bert England was also famous for inventing. Bert England was the all-time master of this mirror technology. They made the ceramics that they put the mirrors on. They made the mirroring surfaces. The Betatron has 3 mirrors in it, 2 mirrors actually, but it's really 3. I'll explain. The electricity, the small miniaturized version of the zero fuel engine fits in the handle. The little compressor with the gas, everything's just all scaled down. The whole kit and caboodle is there, smaller. The magnets, smaller. The only conventional part is the carbon arc part to the light, but that's negative electricity jumping the gap, but you still get that beautiful white light that you get in a carbon arc lamp. Now, that light is diffusing, which is the exact opposite way that you don't want it to go. It is absolutely wrong. In England and Taws love when things, the wronger the better, because it gives them more to correct. This is how they explained it to me. And they had built a ring mirror. This mirror looked like if you were to take a tube and take it around to the other end and then had a really fine saw and slice that in half. So that now you had 2 half rings. Now the inside surface would be curved like this. And then they mirrored it. And then they put it at the front of the gun. And so what you had now was carbon arc light going off and getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and hitting the outer walls. These mirrors reflected it back to a 3rd mirror that looked like your grandmother, somebody with really small fingers, a thimble that they would use in a sewing kit, something like that, but a little more pointed at the end. And that caught the light coming back this way and beamed it out, and it went through there was a lens of some kind, I don't know what the material was, that lased that light. And that light went out the front of that weapon. It was very bright. And when it hit anything alive, literally disappeared. Literally dematerialized. And they shot it at other things, and it did horrible damage to things. And they were out there at China Lake, and they came back, and you'd hear them singing songs, and they were all so happy because they got no complaints. Nobody said it couldn't work because it was radiant energy, and nobody said it couldn't work because it didn't have ammunition, and there was no complaints. The Americans were jubilant. That is the Americans that saw this at China Lake. The men in uniform loved it. This was a quantum step forward. We're talking 1958. So by 1960, they had this in various configurations, and they had it miniaturized down to about that long, handheld, about that long. Much like what Tom Bearden's writing about from Mr. Klimov.
Klimov.
Yeah.
Klimov. The Russian.
But this was not from Russia, this was from England. And they had figured this out using the bits and pieces that they had put together and their own innovations. And this didn't have any German technology in it. This was one of the first pure plays that they came up with on their own. I only know where one of them is anymore. Only one. I only have possession of one of them. But I know that there were more than one built, and I know that they went to the United States.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
You say it hits someone and they disappear.
They told me that
when you turn the beam off, do they reappear or they're just fake, they're gone?
they have been absorbed into a region of cold that is so cold that it literally disassembles them, and they are gone. Ian said, when you dematerialize something like that, it's as if they never existed. Every trace of them is gone, which is frightening. And it had religious connotations, because when you talk like that, you mean you killed their soul. You know, right away, the first thing they do, that's supernatural electricity, and now you've taken their soul from them.
Which, of course, is not true.
Which, of course, is not true. But this is the kind of language that they were greeted with after. The first people that see these things love it. Ted Rattray told me I was going to be a billionaire. But Ted Rattray almost got fired for saying that. And Ted Rattray was never allowed to write a check. In fact, they transferred him to another department. The Americans who saw this and wrote the reports were enamored of it. They never saw a group of men so happy with their work. Well, not since the solid fuels for the Polaris missiles. Yet, by the time that it left China Lake and made its way to Texas and Washington, where the world is run from, with Texas, then it was like it was a non-event, that it didn't happen, and everybody was transferred to hither, thither, and yon, and told, if you ever say another word about this again, we'll bury you. Right? So
did the Americans buy the technology?
No, they didn't even put a bid on it. They just stonewalled the whole thing, and they told Yan, sent a back channel note to him, but Yan said, well, this is the exact same technology that we're doing here with the cold heat engine. Now, you're going to be buying them from us anyway. Why not do it now? Why not later? And as you know, I worked at DesignX in the summer of 1960 and again in the summer of 1961. And why that's important to this tape is because in 1960, the special projects had not been terminated, but in 1961, Eisenhower canceled everything. Eisenhower had his arm twisted. My dad found out all about the how, who, where, why, and when. Nelson Rockefeller found out about these from the engineers. The Exxon engineers at Houston were calling back to Houston and telling people there. And that worked its way up to the top. And when Nelson Rockefeller found out about this, he made some calls and he verified all this. And apparently he got in touch with, summoned Eisenhower to wherever he was, and Eisenhower came like he had to. And he said, and he told him, this all has to be made to go away, and all of that up there has to stop, because we're not going to be able to contain this anymore, and we're just a breaking news story away from having a disaster. And it could cause World War II. Because this will upset the Russians, and the Russians will say we broke the hegemony. And they've always got, if you're not going to buy more oil, we're going to give you nuclear war. That'll be your punishment. You being the populations of the world, these elites got to push that oil. They got to push that oil. My father, it was a bitter pill. Yan, it was horrible for him. But they could see what was coming, and so it was at that time, it started there. We were making a disaster recovery, my dad's words were disaster recovery program, a corporate disaster recovery program. That is how they visualized the next company in the chain. DesignX was going to be wound down and taken out of business. The technologies were going to be transferred to a new company that didn't have a track record, and we were going to take this in other directions and look for other sponsors and take the electrical, the fuelless electric motor, and we were going to try and put it in it and put it in all kinds of products.
Before we get into that, how was Eisenhower able to convince Diefenbaker to, all this technology would have had tremendous benefit to Canada. There had to be a sort of a carrot and the stick thing that Eisenhower used with Diefenbaker.
You're right, spot on. That's exactly what there was. President Eisenhower told John Diefenbaker that he was to terminate and make sure that everything was destroyed. Not only terminated, but eliminated every trace of it. And so this pogrom against the project started. The first to go was John Frost, who himself was window dressing in the first place,
The straw man.
he was the straw man, and then they debunked him and sent him off to oblivion in New Zealand. The stories about the Russians, now the Russians had the same thing, and that was part of the hegemony between America and Russia. They agreed to America said, we'll show you what we're building. You don't want to have to compete with us in this. This is very expensive. You got to build a society. The American goal was to overthrow communism, to have the Russians grow a capitalist nation and be able to throw off the burdens of communism and become a modern state. This is what my dad was told. This is what Yayan and my dad told me. However, they threw the baby out with the bathwater, and the human potential could be much better served with these technologies than without them. Now we've got President Eisenhower. After they're terminated, he comes to Canada to visit with Prime Minister Diefenbaker.
Was Diefenbaker involved before the projects were canceled?
Diefenbaker got the call from Washington on the then equivalent of the hotline, and he did what he was told to do. But he was told he'd be having a personal debrief with Dwight Eisenhower, the president, before the president left office. And that happened. That happened a couple of months, 3 months before the meeting took place. The meeting place, the projects were canceled in the cold weather in December, and the meeting actually happened in the warmer weather, I think the following June, and it was a fishing trip. And Dwight Eisenhower and John Diefenbaker, who didn't like fishing and didn't like the outdoors particularly, went on a so-called fishing. They had a lot of shore lunches. And in that deal that was made, President Eisenhower assuaged PM Diefenbaker by telling him, look, there's a great transformation coming here. Our aerial photographs show us that you've got an oil deposit here, the tar sands, that stretch from northern Manitoba all the way over to the other side of Alberta. Probably more oil there, as much oil there, the equivalent of Saudi Arabia. Canada's going to be the new Saudi Arabia after we pump out all that oil over there because it's in unstable hands, and we got to get that oil out of the ground before we go to your oil. And what we have to do is we have to have you to understand that there's going to be a glowing future for Canada, and all the Canadians are going to get a check like they do in Saudi Arabia today, or an oil royalty check. They'll have less taxes or pay the same taxes, but they're going to get extra money from this oil because there's only 15 million Canadians, Mr. President, and you've got, as I say, as much oil or more oil than Saudi Arabia had. So this was the tactic that President Eisenhower used on the naive and country bumpkinish, very unsophisticated, Bible-pounding John Diefenbaker. Didn't take long before Diefenbaker had completely absorbed the ideology and the almost buffoon bigotry that Eisenhower had really impressed on his mind. And so we had almost a church, strike almost, we had a church-like zeal in eradicating every trace of those projects. It wasn't only that the projects disappeared, but it was everything about them disappeared. Every word that was in the news archives disappeared. Things were being purged. They took these plays came out of the Russian playbook, and they were doing them in Canada. And my father and other men formerly who'd been with the intelligence services looked at this, and they weren't alarmed or unalarmed. They were just in a cold, dispassionate way noticing how now that the Americans had this hegemony deal with the Russians, we were using Russian tactics on Canadian citizens in ways that should never have happened. And my father always said, it's just a small step from here to them doing it in America.
The Polaroid that you have of Ian Thomas in the basement.
Well, it was actually it was in the building at Merton Street. They closed DesignX that year, and they had the machine, and they took that machine from the DesignX office. They were in the process of winding it out. There was no new tenant moving in. That is the cold heat engine, the exact one that Ralph Long of Dun & Bush Incorporated had sold Yayan some materials to which he didn't believe that they were going to be able to do what they said they were going to do. And he came over and checked the machine. Well, on another occasion, they were running tests, and there was some complaint from somewhere. Well, we later learned that the complaint came from the National Cash Register Company, which was all.
But you say they were running the machine. They had installed the machine in the basement?
They took it was not, it was a half basement. It didn't, when you went in the door, you walked down a few steps and you were in like a basement. There was no main floor per se. That was the main floor. And that was where the cooling was not a big factor back then. Heating was the big factor because the Merton Street location was right on the crosstown rail spur. They don't even use that rail spur anymore.
Well, my question is, why had they taken this secret device and they were parading it in public?
They weren't exactly parading it in public. My father had reached a point with them where he said, we're not going to put in any more money into, I'm not going to put any more money into something that is absolutely blocked and so on off. But if you want to talk to other people who might, I'll go along with that. This is what he said to Ian. And Ian said, do you know anybody who might? And my father said, well, maybe Alan Block will. And then there these other two brothers. So they were getting ready for a test, and they were running the machine on this particular day.
So they brought the machine out of cold
from Designex on a truck and put it in this building. Took the furnace out first, and then put the machine in, because it was the summertime, where the furnace had been. The furnace was one of those big oil tank and a heater, oil heating. And they took the furnace out, and they put that machine there, and they were testing it. And there were some static electricity problems at the National Cash thing, and National Cash called in and complained to the Ontario Hydro.
How close were they?
Well, they were on the north side of the street, of Merton Street, where this building was on the south side, and they were very close to Mount Pleasant, so they were about 3 blocks away. And the hydro people came and asked what was going on. They were going up and down the street to everybody, and they came and Ian and Bert England said, well, we're here conducting a little lab experiment. And the more that they talked, the more excited the Ontario Hydro people got, and it got a little confrontational, a little testy. I arrived in the middle of that, and then the Toronto District Supervisor arrived. And he started to have an argument with Bert England, and the arguments never stopped. And finally they came, and I saw them. They started cutting the wires, and you would think that this would upset them. It didn't upset them at all. But the first one to start laughing at them was Ian Toss. And they explained that what we have here is a small Niagara Falls type generator, and that with the energy, the electricity that's powering this is being sucked right in out of the atmosphere we're breathing. This is ambient energy going into that machine and coming out through those magnets, generating cold electricity. This is negative electricity. It works just as good as the positive stuff. And just because people didn't know about it before doesn't mean it's not doing this. Well, the electrical engineer who was the district manager for Hydro had never heard of such blasphemy, and he was taught that authority is always right. And he said, I remember saying a very unkind thing to Bert England. He said, bullshit may baffle brains, but not here. This is Toronto Hydro, mister. And he said, we're taking this all down. This is all over here. The man thought he was in charge. And they cut the wires, and they said, is this fuse box, is this yours? No, this is all. They took the fuse box out. They took the meter out of the building. There were no fuses because there was no fuse box. All of that was gone. This building was on its own. It was cut off. But the lights were going, and when you opened, they had they always had used fridges was one of the things they bought a lot of. Wherever they went, they always had one because they kept their beer cold in there. Because the tests would go on night and day, and you had to have a place to put sandwiches, that half-eaten food, you put it in the fridge. A few beers, that was fine. And I just couldn't believe my eyes and ears. My father, we watched this go on, and they sent for a flat. The arguments got worse and worse and worse, and these English people they were always polite, were needling this guy because he was out of line and he wasn't listening to. They clearly knew more than he did, and he couldn't accept that role. He had to be the boss, the big dog, and so he was. And there were many calls on his phone in his truck. He didn't ask to use the phone there. And they finally a flatbed truck arrived as it was late in the afternoon, because in the summer times the light we'll have light till 9 o'clock at night. And they took a saw, and they had just built these new hydro poles on Merton Street, the big ones. We usually have wooden poles. We used to have wooden poles here, like foam poles, but that all changed. And now they had these big, huge poles with a big arcing thing that went over and a huge light. It was very modern. The cement was almost not dry on this thing when they were cutting it down. They cut the pole down. They put it onto a flatbed truck. They took all the wires that led to that building, and they took the fuse box and everything that belonged to hydro and drove it away on a truck driving east towards to wherever they were going. And it was getting dark, and the lights were on, and the fridge door was going, and they were drinking beer, and the thing was generating electricity, and they had radios working, and everybody knew about it. There was even a story supposed to be going into the newspaper, but it got spiked. And that was the first time that I had ever seen a face-off, a real nitty-gritty, down-and-dirty face-off between those who claimed to be authorities and the real authorities. And the problem was that the people who were claiming to be authorities were the authorities from Ontario Hydro, but they didn't know the first thing about advanced electrodynamics. And the people who did know it were drinking beer and laughing and talking about all the money they were going to make in the future, which didn't happen. After I saw the model in Yayan's desk of Silverbug, that was the first time I saw a model. I never saw the real ship. Never saw what the model was based on that was out at Avro, but Yayan and Bert England worked on that, and so did Dee and Taz, and they would draw me little diagrams. They knew I'd seen the model. And it was the love of their life. That was really the crowning achievement of all the projects. And as I say, they drove it away from the airport, and I was told it took off and flew and went to the United States. And not in a flatbed truck either. It just left that area by flatbed truck. They took it somewhere where they could, up in Aurora someplace, where they could get it off the ground.
Did the pilots have to have any special characteristics? Like, did they have to shave their eyebrows or shave the...
Nobody ever knew. I didn't even know that there were pilots, but there were. There were a lot of things that at that age, bear in mind, I was 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 at that time. And I didn't think to ask questions like this. And these are great questions. I do not know the answer.
Okay, so let's move forward to the point where everything has been migrated or is in the process of migrating out of Canada, and DesignX is trying to get other work, correct? Or what they were trying to...
DesignX had a contract to tell the Bell... The contract that Yayan mentions in the DVD, Part 19, we had a contract off the Bell telephone that sustained us for a little bit further. That particular contract had to do with Bell Telephone didn't know how many telephone poles they had, and they really wanted to know. And it didn't take them very long at all to tell the Bell Telephone Company exactly what the number of telephone poles in Ontario were. But this was not done by sending people out into the field to count the telephone poles. The Bell Canada was grateful. They came back with more contracts. So there were new contracts, but basically, given all the success, DesignX was getting to be a heartache, because by 1962, Yayan could see the writing on the wall. The Americans were manufacturing cars in Canada in ever greater numbers, and there should have been a tremendous amount of work in automotive design, because they were still trading. They were making cars look new. The new model was everything. So after about 2 years, you had to have there was going to be a major design change. The more changes in the body and the design, the more advances underneath meant more tools, more jigs, more dies, more machines that had to be designed for new shapes and contours and that never existed before. So the work seemed to be good, but when Dad looked at the books of the company, he saw that company was going sideways and losing money every year. Not losing not losing money per se. They were still making some money, but they were not gaining in market share, and they were slowly being eroded away. Yayan knew that DesignX had a limited shelf life and that it wasn't going to be a long-term company in Canada anymore, and that somehow something was going on where other people were getting, other companies, smaller companies, less able to deliver the services, and it wasn't price, because Yayan had chopped his prices down to survival mode. And Yayan was squeezed out, and in 1968...
Just a quick question.
Sure.
Were you offered oil company contracts, Shell, or were you offered any fat contracts, or...
Yayan was offered fat contracts in the areas of pipelining. TransCanada Pipeline asked Yayan if he had any improvement ideas on the pipelines as they were then, and the president of TransCanada Pipelines was on the phone to DesignX, talking in person with Yayan. As long as Yayan didn't raise the issue of asking for financing to develop the machine. So Yayan came up with the next thing, the reinvention of the pipeline. He took the elements of the zero fuel engine, the negative electricity, the fact that it ran cold, had Bert England and Ian Tawes do calculations. These were men with slide rules, and sure enough, he wrote a report up called Solids Pipelining. And they even made a model, like a small model, like an Lionel electric train at DesignX. And what this was about was taking a tube that was about 2.5 inches in diameter, a hose like that, and pumping coal gas through it, and so till it got rigid. And anything that they wanted to pipeline, they pelletized into acorn size or jelly bean size, but round pellets, but they didn't have to be perfectly round. And they would send them down the pipeline under pressure, and they found that when the temperature got down to about 20 below zero, they could send much more volume down much faster, and they didn't need a pig to have to go down and scour every third or fourth load either, the interior scraper. And they could get rid of a lot of the extra pumping sections in there because they didn't need those sections now, because they had all the pressure that they could ever want. And at the other end, they were able to manage this. And they found that they could pipeline water, and they could anything oil. They wanted to do it with grain. They wanted to do it with all kinds of things. Just pelletize it and pipeline it to wherever if it was something that was bulk shipped by ship, to the portlands. If it was something that was bulk consumed, to the distribution points. They want to pipeline a lot of things beyond what TransCanada Pipelines are doing. And there was an engineering person that called and asked to speak to Yayan, and I know they asked Yayan if everybody there was drinking all the time. And they either didn't want to believe it or didn't want to come and see the model. Yayan told them, "We built your model. We've got it. It's working. Why don't you come by and see us? We'll show you what we have in mind. We've got lots of pipeline work we can do. We can make pipelining. We can replace pipelining. Can replace transportation. We'll get the costs way down." And these kinds of conversation were table talk at our house and on Sundays when Yayan used to get to come a couple of times a month. And nothing ever happened with it. And then Yayan put out the Advanced Materials Recovery Project, which I sent to you. And recently I sent you an email about somebody that's talked about, this is mining the surface of the bottom, not mining below the surface of the bottom. And somebody in England has decided that this is what they want to do. The company's listed on the Toronto Stock Exchange recently. The nodules in gold and silver, it's a very cheap way to ice encase everything. And again, the mystery to all this was this mesh that Bert England and Ian Tawes came up with, which is basically platinum and copper, fine extruded wires turning into a mesh that they would drop down over whatever if they isolated. However, they isolate what's down there, I guess, with machines that tell them, oh, this is gold or this is whatever the nodules were. There's a way to know with sensors what's there. That's how they find them. All this prospecting is done with machines that tell them what they get reactions to what's on the bottom. When they find something that they want, they drop the mesh over it. And then they put a hose within a hose. The first hose, the smaller hose, is like around, you see them in the summertime, they fold flat. But when you screw it on the nozzle outside your house and turn the tap on, they blow up fat, and they've got holes all around them, so you got things blowing out. Well, these are air holes, so what you got is air just pumped in from the surface, and that hose that's pumping the air out under pressure is inside a cold water hose. This is fresh water from the surface. If the ship is big enough, if you're in salt water, you have to bring fresh water. They just get it from some other source. And you pump that down in the second tube. So now you've got a real cold air being pumped out into real cold water that's fresh water, not salt water. And you pump that down, and it gets colder and colder and colder because the fibers in the tubes are, again, the same as the mesh, copper and platinum. And what happens is that when the water, the fresh water and the air, which is now the only thing that keeps it from freezing solid is that it's under pressure and it's moving. And when it gets squirted out over the bottom of the structure, it freezes instantly because of the negative electricity running through the mesh. And you can ice encase these things and float them with a flotation device to the surface. And it hasn't been done. Nobody's ever done it. But I'm sure they're going to be doing it. And the only person that I know that has the information is you. Because I sent you the original of the report. I think I kept a copy maybe. But you've got that copy. And there were some other things that they came up with, and these were all along this variations on a standard theme of things that they wanted to do. That
weren't they involved in cleaning up Lake Ontario?
Now, this wasn't really so much a question of cleaning up Lake Ontario. This was a question that there were two things going on. This was the aim of that test was the purification of water. They were going to take water that they pulled right out of the bay down here at Cherry Street, and they had to get permission from the Mayor of Toronto at that time, and they got permission from the Mayor of Toronto at that time through Gordon Riley. This was another one of those projects where Gordon Riley was the sponsor, and my dad stood in the background. And they set this thing up to down here at Cherry Street, and they put a thing that looked basically, to imagine a waste paper basket, but a waste paper basket shape covered in a mesh that was, the squares were about that big, a little under an inch. What they want to keep fish, and they wanted to keep deadwood out, and they wanted to keep full beer, anything that's detritus that's lying on the bottom of the lake underwater that's settled and covered with sediment. They didn't want to get that in the pump and bugger up the pump, so they put a housing over the thing that was basically a mesh to keep big things from getting in the pump. And it was generated by the same engine, the same power plant. They took it out of Merton Street and took it down to this place. That was a Gordon Riley project. And at least he was doing it for Gordon Riley with the hopes that Riley would put up, $100 million. So, and Riley had $500 million, and he was liquid. So the first day, they put it in the water. They attached it to a working machine, which just never got turned off. The machine didn't get turned off, and they turned the power on, and it started. And the pumping went on basically all night and all day. And I just loved that stuff. He'd be down there 24, sleep in the back of his car, get up, just loved that stuff. It was aerodrome time again. And there, as a byproduct of this, there was a tremendous amount of muck coming up off the bottom through the hose, pulled up with the water. And they had to have dump trucks come along and clean that up and take that away. And somebody got the bright idea as saying, well, this is non-garbage landfill, because all the landfill in around this part of the country is all garbage landfill. And people didn't want it because, if you grow tomatoes 10 years later and people eat them, they get leukemia and die. You can't, a lot of the planning we've done is wrong. So they had this happening, and the dump trucks were carrying loads of fresh, new, solid ground material that had been pulled up off the bottom of that lake. And they were dump trucking it east and north up the Highway 400 to Cottage Country, east to Oshawa, and west down to where the grape growers needed unsullied landfill. And there were so many complaints after the third day from so many motorists about all these dump. It was all over talk radio in Toronto those 3 days. I mean, nobody ever saw so many dump trucks. And as a result of that, that project was canceled. What it did prove was that with a little hose, that was the solid thing, but they didn't freeze the water solid. They weren't pelletizing this water. They just turned it on full boogie and turned it on and left it on for 3 days. And they got to a layer of water that was pure enough to drink, and they could have cut the cost of water in Toronto could have been cut to 5% of what it was costing right then. They could have done that, but they didn't, because they didn't like the engine. The engine didn't have any gasoline, didn't have any diesel fuel, didn't have any of that stuff. He's down there doing it again. And the mayor, of course, was on to the province, and the province, they had the hydro guy, and it was the same hydro guy. They promoted that man that was up at, they did, for standing up to Bert. And he played the fool. He didn't realize he was a buffoon. So the results were so damn dramatic that anyway, Yayan did it to himself again, and bam, that was over. And it just kept going. It wasn't. There were all kinds of things that came along, and Yayan would overachieve. And instead of being like Caesar, he didn't get a parade. He didn't get a festival. He got derided and booted out, but it was all orchestrated from above. And when Gordon Riley got a dose of what my father had been getting for all those years, Gordon Riley's, he was a gentleman. He sent my father a case of Dalwhinnie Scotch. He said, "I'm sorry, I had no idea what you were running into." And they became friends. Yayan couldn't divide and conquer at all, because my father wasn't going for that anyway. Riley was an Irishman, which really helped. Doyle and Riley, they got along really good. Anyway, my dad got along well with Gordon Riley and his brother, and they could see the handwriting on the wall. And that handwriting on the wall said, "No super science allowed. Go away. This is dog patch. We are keeping Canada dog patch. We don't want progress here. We want things we understand. Oil we understand. Coal we understand. We've even got nuclear electricity right up here at the nuclear plant at Pickering. And we don't need anything that is too space age that nobody can understand and isn't in any textbooks," and stuff like that. And finally, with their tail between their legs, the axiom, if you build a better mousetrap, they will beat a path to your door. The truth was outed forever that if you build a better mousetrap and you can do more with less, you will be punished out of existence. You will be drummed out of this community, and you will have to go and start all over somewhere else where people aren't so naive to let you overturn the whole apple cart, which is all an energy economy based on oil and gasoline. And so this Yayan's attempt to find other sources of money, that was the last hurrah. Nobody ever came near them again. He still had my father, but my father now was into what my dad called disaster recovery. The disaster recovery mode was to create new companies and to take the proprietary technologies and migrate them from DesignX into a new corporation. The first corporation, and Yayan mentions it, he said, "We're going to create a new company," or "We have created a new company called Energetics." Where this name came from, Energetics did not come from Russia. The name Energetics the Russians got from Canada. I'm here to tell you authoritatively. And I meant to show you the source book because it's sitting on top of my Dell computer tower. But it was my mother's book. In fact, it was my mother's British Oxford dictionary, the big with the blood color cover. That's the old one. Her model sitting up there, and that was the book that that was her book for playing Scrabble. In that book, if you open it up, you turn to E, and you'll see that my mother had taken a red pen and circled the name Energetics, and that was the name that that my father chose for this, and it says energetics, the subject and the study of electricity. And that's where that name came from. And of course, the Russians, like everything else, claimed that they have a new science called energetics. Well, the new science, they got energetics. The name was given to them by none other than my mother. It's a true story. Cross my heart.
How did your mother get it to the Russians?
My mother gave it to my father gave it to Designex, and the Russians were listening when Yayin went out to Designex and was talking at Avro. They had the place bugged. They found the bugs. It's in the Metrokin Archive, Book 3. The disaster recovery plan was to create a firm called Energetics and to turn it into consumer products that people would want because they would cost less to operate, that we would manufacture and sell. And that's when I went looking for an engineer, and after about a year and a bit's search, I found one. I brought him home, and he was vetted by my dad and by Yayin over and over and over. My friend Daniel's met him. And what we have, and I showed you a photograph of he and his wife yesterday, who I selected based on a whole bunch of criteria, principally that he didn't get his degree at an effete university, that he got his degree the same way Yayin had got his degree, by apprenticing for 6 years, under conditions that were familiar to me so that I could understand those. And a number of other criteria. But in the end, I brought him to them, but they agreed after lots of talk. And he wasn't approved just overnight or over 2 weeks. That project went on. It began in 1997, and so it was 2 years. That's 2 more years of expensive construction. That's 2 more years of having to
Expensive construction of what?
Well, they rebuilt the cold heat engine system. They built a new one. They taught this engineer that I brought onto the scene how to do this. Bert England came out of retirement. All of that's in the book. It's all expressed in the contracts, all of these details. With that engineer and with Yayin Thomas and Bert England, who is still here in Canada, he didn't go to the States. Either did Yayin.
Can you confirm those dates again? Because I think you went backwards. Yeah.
Yes, the Energetics was created in the period 1968 to 1973. Then in 1973, my mother got in my dad's Cadillac car to drive to see her friend June McGurr, and she drove over to June's house, and she thought she smelled something in the car, and she stepped out of the car and walked towards June's house. She put her finger on to ring the bell, touched the bell, and the car went off. I mean, it just exploded. And they were sending us a message, but my dad was prudent and smart enough to know not to react to this, not to let them turn this to steal the subject and morph that into something else, and that didn't happen. Bottom line is that basically nothing was done excepting we knew that there was going to have to be a whole lot more disaster recovery planning to keep the products alive and to have a chance to bring this to a market somewhere. So we created this last corporation in that series, which was called Entrain Systems. And the man that I presented, they agreed to, and he was completely vetted, not only vetted for all the things you would vet an engineer for, but he was invited to my father's 65th birthday party in our home. We had the original, we had several of the original engines in storage at that time. I needed to know that if something happened to my dad and Yayin and Bert, if they all got killed in crashes or grew so old and the time was so long, I needed to have somebody who could build this today. Now, today's date, 2012, June, July. And so I needed somebody that they could train without any help from anyone to build these systems. These systems are rather complicated affairs to get balanced, to get them going. And
so you said but it cost a lot of money.
It cost a lot of money to pay for Bert and to pay for Yayin.
So you had to pay them to come back.
My dad had to pay them. It cost money to get their time, to get them to pay this guy to learn how to build these, and a laboratory was involved. Anyway, it went on and there's a wonderful story there that shows the innocence. And it shows that the Toronto Police Department really do listen to phone calls, because one day, I wasn't there, but my dad came home and told me, he said that a chief of police is a very rare thing in Toronto. We have 5 chiefs in Toronto, but you don't see them out doing beat work. They're in various police stations. doing executive work. And one day, my father was there with this particular engineer, and Bert England was there, and Ian Thomas, and Jerry Danilak, and a couple of the other helpers there. And who should arrive? A chief of police in uniform. And he came down and he said, "I'd like to come in and see the machine." And they said, "Certainly." And they just welcomed him as if they'd been expecting him all his life. And he said, "Well, we've been listening to the phone calls, and we have a bet going on at the station house that what you've got down here is a still. I want to see it." And they all laughed, and my dad had his ID, and Ian had his ID. And Ian and this police captain and my dad had Canadian Club, I think it was. They were mixing with water. And the policeman told him, "We've been listening to this, and this is the damnedest thing." And he liked it. He loved it. He saw there was no gasoline going in. He saw that it was doing just fine. And what my guy learned to build was a gas management system, and which I believe sincerely that the proper name for that gas management system, when science has a chance to evaluate it properly with men like Bearden, that the name electromagnetic proton radiation, this fits the standard definition of that. And we believe that's what this is, what William Line wrote so eloquently about with monoatomic oxygen. We believe we've got that going all the time, 100% with CO2 gas. What they did not show this particular engineer, and what I asked him not to show him, was how to treat, condition the windings and the magnets part. Because I know that I've got all the magnets I'm ever going to need are in storage right now to build enough systems so that people can learn from what it is. I didn't want this particular person to have all of it, but I wanted him to have enough so that when the time came, I would have somebody to come along and think, "Oh, well, you think it's part of the past, it has to be redeveloped?" Wrong.
Were these neodymium or barium ferrite magnets?
Both. But I believe the neodymium magnets are not the ones there's one kind you want, there's one kind that you don't particularly want. And I believe the other ones you mentioned are the ones you want.
The barium ferrite?
Yeah.
Can't get them anymore.
Well, you can get anything. Tom Bearden wrote this wonderful article about the Halbach array effect and about how it wasn't to you, but it was some correspondence he was having. I've read all that correspondence. They talk about how the government loaned somebody some money for a part of a project and then seized this project on them so that they couldn't make these asymmetric magnetic shapes anymore, where if the poles go this way and that way and this way, which ends up giving you what you need. And
Howard Johnson achieved that by different means.
Yes, he did. Yes, he did, by different means. But nobody knew. Howard was so bloody secretive that we didn't know what Howard knew until you published it.
Out of his education, you deliberately omitted the magnetic conditioning part.
I asked them to withhold that.
Right.
Because I've got examples of that, and he can be shown that, and I've got the magnets that go into that, and all the components that anyone would ever need, and it's not going to take very long. This particular engineer is real sharp. And he'll be able to do this, no problems. This is well within the competency range, even though it's very advanced science. He had 18 months, day to day, with he didn't have to hold down a job. He was getting $700 and something a week from my dad for showing up there to work instead of doing rush repairs on the air conditioning for Cadillac cars, and he was making quite a bit of money. So my friend could now do it without anybody helping him, from beginning to end, and that was a huge, major step in the consolidation, in the inheritance and the consolidation, because if you look at these plans, it appears to entail a whole bunch of things that never happened and were never designed to happen. To set up a manufacturing thing, you not only need key engineers to know how to do it, but you've got to figure out manufacturing systems and ways to source all the materials, and you have pricing, and you have to have warehousing, and you have to have shipping, and you need a legal department for the warranties, and because if you're going anywhere near wall electricity, you need to fit UI or UL. It has to be approved by so many different things. We then had something that I felt, okay, well, now what we've got is I've got redundancy in depth. I've got parts. I've got the logs that start from the very first day when the Iron first organized how they were going to keep the records, because you don't want to keep going over this all the men had to be able to read the records of all the tests, and they went back and looked through things when they ran into blocks or they had to change things. And as I'm sure Bedini does, and I'm sure Bearden must have done this, it's the scientific method to find out, have I covered this territory before? Is there something I've overlooked in these steps? Because those magnets, the human eye can't see these things, and we have to build machines to be able to know what's going on. So then I had the elements. The last time I sat with him was in 1999. He came over to my house. He was leaving. He was going to this other place, leaving Toronto. He had some frozen food. He brought a couple of roasts and some fish. He said he was leaving, and he did. And we visited for 2 days. We had it was touching. It was the end of, I realized I would be seeing him again. And I didn't. I was told that he died, a woman I know who I'd met at another friend of Yain's, stopped me on the street and asked me if I heard the bad news about Yain. That's how I learned that he had died. This isn't dead and buried. The disaster recovery program will either come up with machines that will go out a side door or a back door, or hopefully some group of families that are powerful enough that have reach enough to have businesses and industries that need this kind of technology can buy this for a very low price. I can sell them something that will have enduring value and change the paradigm on this earth. One of the neat little things that Yain and Bert came up with was an anti-tampering device. So we can now technoguard this. I don't know if I ever got into technoguarding with you, but Bert England and Yain Thomas learned how to technoguard these machines. And if anybody goes near them with a screwdriver and starts to take them apart, to take apart where the gas housing is, where the magnets are inside there, the whole thing goes kabang. Somebody would get badly damaged. But of course, this wasn't sold by, it just takes a thing about the size of your thumb, a compound 4 put in there. And if they try to take it apart, to reverse engineer it, it just blows up. So sorry.
What I would anticipate would be in the appendix would be one container which contains a cold heat engine number 1, cold heat engine number 2.
Well, there's more than 2. There's more than 4.
Okay, and
all the parts, all the logs, all the Design X logs, all the energetic, all of it.
Okay.
And there's a Betatron weapon in there. There's in the crate. There's some other things too. I haven't gotten into with you. Now, what we're talking about really here is we have a completely ready to go, finished working set of machines. We have a whole bunch we have all the records of of the science that went in step by step to building and inventing and reinventing over longer than 10 years from 13 floors at Design X. All done properly the British way.
Let me ask you this. No one stepped up to the plate so far. So what has changed that would stimulate someone to step up to the plate now?
I embrace you for asking me that question. That is the wonderful question you've asked me today. And it gives me the opportunity to say this lovingly to you. It's you, and you, Pat. The wonderful, I don't believe that Tom Bearden and John Bedini's work would have ever gotten into, people like me who look for this kind of thing would ever have heard of that without you. It's you that have made this possible. If any success happens here, it won't be me going around saying, oh, gee, look what I've done. I'll be saying, oh, gee, look what Tony Craddock did. Tony Craddock brought this information to the world and said, I'm not going to tell you this is true or not true. I believe it's true. I'm going to bring you the stories and the people that are involved in this. We're going to put it on DVD and we're going to sell it for basically cost plus a little so that we can keep on making these tapes. At the moment, they are not as popular as they should be. You would be horrified at the percentage of people in America who've never heard the name John Bedini.
Those are kind words, Bill, but I think you're placing too much credence on what...
You and Pat definitely have established the beachhead. They had this completely sealed. The oil guys, your counterparts in the oil business, had this all stopped up until you came along. Now there are people... I have read all those books, every word in all of them. I've read most of those books twice. and underlined lots of passages. I've watched all the DVDs. I'm going to watch every DVD several more times. I love this subject. It's all true. It's like going to church for me. It is the closest thing to a pure religion that I know of. It is a pure religion. God put everything on the planet that humankind would need, including the energy. So all I can do is put it out there and to work on the contacts that I have and to try and develop new ones where possible. I don't get out much. I'm not very social anymore. So to the best that I can, I will continue to try and sell what I've got. And if I don't get a buyer for what I've got, that will just be one that got away.